Our first guest is Chief Anne Richardson, who has been chief of the Rappahannock tribe since her election in 1998, and the first woman to lead a tribe in Virginia since the 18th century. In 1989, Chief Anne helped to organize the United Indians of Virginia, which was established as an intertribal organization represented by all tribal chiefs. In 1991, Chief Anne became executive director of the Matapani Pamunkey Monacan Incorporated that provides training and employment services for Virginia Indians. And just now, we've been learning about her latest activism, which I think is amazing, and I hope University of Richmond can be a partner in bringing that dream to life. Dr. David Wilkins is a citizen of the Lumbee Nation of North Carolina and a political scientist specializing in federal Indian policy and law. He is the E. Claiborne Robbins Distinguished Professor in Leadership Studies at the Jepson School here at the University of Richmond, and a recipient of the American Political Science Association's Daniel Elazar Distinguished Federalism Award. Dr. Jacinta Ruru, who is here with us virtually, is the first Māori professor of law in New Zealand. She was born in Australia and completed her master's at UR's partner, University of Otago, with a thesis on the Treaty of Waitangi and national parks in New Zealand. Dr. Ruru received her doctorate at the University of Victoria in Canada. She then returned to the University of Otago, where she now holds a sesquicentennial distinguished chair in recognition of her outstanding research, teaching, and service. Dr. Ruru's research centers on indigenous peoples, primarily Māori in New Zealand and First Nations in Canada, legal relations with land and water. In the 2022 New Year Honors, Dr. Ruru was appointed a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to Māori and the law, and this year also received the University of Otago's Distinguished Research Medal. It's a great honor for us here at the University of Richmond to welcome these visitors, and Dr. Ruru, we eagerly are listening to your lecture. Thank you for being with us.
So tēnā koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. So particularly in my language, and the first language of Aotearoa New Zealand, and the Māori language, I greet you all. I thank you all for being here, and I thank you for this opportunity. And I particularly want to acknowledge Anne and David and the indigenous peoples of the United States of America. So thank you. And as I said, it's an enormous honor to have this opportunity to be with you. I'm going to share my screen. So it's an enormous honor to have this opportunity to contribute today as part of this week of focus on Aotearoa New Zealand, and to be together to dream for what I really hope for are more just futures. So my talk is a fast-paced dive into the laws of Aotearoa New Zealand. And to commence, I must applaud and honour the Indigenous nations, and especially those who I'm going to be talking about today here in Aotearoa New Zealand, Ngāi Tūhoe and the Whanganui Iwi, who have an incredible experience to share with us nationally and internationally of how two recent statutes, legislation, have marked a significant positive transformation for our environmental legal knowledge, the recognition of personality of Te Urewera and the Whanganui River in law. So the story I can simply share is why I believe the legal personality solution can transform constitutional and environmental law. So to begin with a beginning of some sorts, the point I really want to emphasise that all the lands in Aotearoa New Zealand were once entirely Māori lands and continue to be Māori lands. The lands and waters that some of my ancestors deliberately travelled oceans to discover became the peoples of Raukawa, Ngāti Ranganui and Ngāti Maniapoto in the North Island. And if I was in the room with you, I'd be pointing to the North Island, which is kind of the enlarged, or hopefully you're now day 4 of Aotearoa New Zealand, you know the North Island. From us in the Māori world, the North Island is Te Ika a Maui, the great fish of the demigod, and the South Island, one of our stories, is that was his boat, whereupon he fished up the North Island. And if I was there, I'd point out my tribal areas where I come from, sort of that middle part of the North Island. So these are lands that many of my ancestors have made ours by entwining our Polynesian identity deeply within to shape our own identity. So to who Māori are today entirely only makes sense from these lands and waters. And we have stories that tell us about the lands, why the lands are shaped the way they are. And those stories contain our laws, our Māori laws for how we live. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that as we go through. And if I had time, I'd talk about how Maui, the first one actually, over up on the top, it'll be your top left-hand corner, you can see Maui there on his boat fishing up the North Island. So that's one of those stories there. You can see just directly below, you can see how Tānei Mahuta, one of our demigods, stood and separated Papatonuku, the Earth Mother, from Ranganui, the Sky Father, by pushing him above. And so within all of these world creation stories, as we know them as Māori, are our laws and values for how we continue to live today. And just briefly, so Aoraki here is the tallest mountain in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Its English name is Mount Cook. Here in as Māori, we understand Aoraki to be the son of our Sky Father, who travelled down to Aotearoa, New Zealand on a boat trying to find his mother, his Earth Mother, couldn't find her, said a prayer incorrectly to return back to the heavens, to the sky, and said that prayer incorrectly and caused himself and the brothers to be able to sort of climb. The boat hit a hidden reef, and the brothers scampered up to the top and turned to stone. And so and for the Ngaitahu people in the South Island, this is their most revered ancestor. And so just one example of those laws, it's completely inappropriate to climb to the top of this mountain, because in our culture, it's inappropriate to touch one's head. And so that whole personification of who we are as people and who our mountains are, they are our ancestors, and we treat them as ancestors. All of these mountains throughout Aotearoa, New Zealand, have incredible stories. Here's Tongariro. He's a male mountain in the middle of the North Island, and he's married to a beautiful mountain called Pihama. And here's Taranaki. He's another male mountain. And long ago, he had this big battle with Taranaki. Well, this is one of the stories. Big battle with Tongariro, sorry. And Taranaki lost that battle, and that's why he was banished from the area, and that's why he sits all alone, all by himself over on the west coast of the North Island. It's quite unusual having this big substantial mountain surrounded by completely flat lands that have now been turned to farmland. And as part of his banishment from that central North Island, started to carve the Whanganui River, which we'll talk briefly about in my short talk today. So these stories were in our Māori lands, and with the British, the Europeans, who are also my ancestors, began travelling to these seas to land upon these shores from really 1769 onwards. And by the late 1830s, the British Crown wanted to claim control of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and a treaty was signed. And I'm sure by day 4, those in the room may have already heard briefly anyway about our Treaty of Waitangi, which is a bilingual treaty that is in Te Reo Māori, in the Māori language, and in the English language. Of course, they don't say the same things. According to Māori retained their sovereignty. According to the English, Māori ceded their sovereignty to the English. Māori have consistently fought to retain their sovereignty and property. Protest against the British Crown's assumption of control was immediate, and by the 1860s, the violence had encapsulated into the New Zealand land wars that went for more than a decade. The colonial project of confiscating Māori property commenced alongside a judicial rhetoric, so those colonial courts joined in with the violence of the guns, and created these kind of precedents that you can see here, that Māori are savage, that they weren't civilised enough to have sovereignty. And this kind of law has remained a prominent part of the New Zealand legal system. Part of this precedent was overruled not until 1987. And then another part of it was not overruled or not removed from our legislate or from our legal books until 2003. So it's had a very pervasive effect on Aotearoa New Zealand, and the creation of national parks and our conservation estate was entirely born within this colonial context. So the British arriving on the shores of this new world, and put new world in quotation marks, wrongly and deliberately regarded large expanses of land as empty spaces, as untouched and wild. An attempt to fill the void as they saw it was to impose the British identities on the land and to put the land to some utilitarian use. And so the notion of protecting land from private speculation emerged in the mid to late 1800s. And so large tracts of land were ring-fenced as Crown land for conservation purposes, and much of this land was stolen from Māori. Te Urewera, the Whanganui River, Mount Taranaki, all share a history with the conservation estate and all becoming encased within national park boundaries. And today the conservation estate is extensive. It encompasses 1/3 of New Zealand's landmass. So since 1987, the law has required those empowered to care for the conservation estate to give effect to our principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. So this is part of a new reconciliation era in New Zealand, where our government is trying to amend those wrongs that have been done to Māori. From a Māori perspective, the Department of Conservation, so that government department empowered to care for 1/3 of these lands, has been slow, and I emphasise slow, to realise this legal mandate. Present conservation legislation and practices arguably continue to reflect antiquated ideas about the value of Māori contributing to biodiversity and conservation in New Zealand. Not surprisingly, Māori leaders have for some time summarised that the conservation protection objective is hostile to customary principle of sustainable use, and our spiritual linkage as Māori to these lands, and have been subjected to paternalistic control, and regard national parks more broadly as gated areas where we as Māori are obstructed from our customary practices, locked out from decision making, and held back from continuing our relationship with sites of deep spiritual or cultural significance. There have been attempts to make changes, and as I said, since really the 1990s, the country has been committed to a modern reconciliation era. And this is my tribal area. Actually, no, it's not. I'm not sharing my tribal area photo. This is actually the Whanganui. It looks like the Whanganui River settlement photo. Sorry, it's a different photo than what I thought was going to be on there. So seeking the return of lands locked up in the conservation estate has been a priority for Māori entering Treaty of Waitangi claim settlement negotiations. But the Crown has laid several parameters around these negotiations, including a general rule that the conservation estate is not available for return to Māori ownership. So Māori have not been able to successfully or the Crown has not been able to open its heart or minds or eyes to the possibility of returning those stolen lands to Māori. And so there's been a deadlock for particularly some of the tribal entities, including from the beginning of the treaty claim settlement negotiations to Urewera National Park. The return of it was one of the bottom lines for Tūhoi. They wanted the lands and waters to be returned to them. The government would not agree. So Tūhoe spent years researching overseas models and ideas that the Crown put forward for managing Te Urewera. This is one of the national parks in the North Island. Tūhoe sent their tribal federation persons worldwide to analyse the effectiveness of models our Crown was proposing, from the Northern Territories to the Arctic Circle, and the response from those indigenous peoples in these places was that those co-management models do not work. Only after this was the Crown prepared to accept a local solution to the issue of ownership. The local solution being legal personality of the environment. That is, that lands and waters can have all the rights and responsibilities of a natural person. So recognising nature as legal persons enables many neat things for us as a country. Legal personality transforms our nation's legal system by placing at the forefront of our society a Māori understanding of all that is around us. And, in the words of our then minister, the Minister of Māori Affairs, legal personality offers us and I'm quoting, profoundly alternative to the human presumption of sovereignty over the natural world. So I think it's remarkable. Our country has recognised a forest, a river, and soon to be a mountain as legal persons. And this is something, I often sort of laugh about this, this is something I never thought would happen, despite arguing that it would be, writing all these journal articles and so on. And it's amazing that it has happened. So what is this legal personality? As persons, you and I, we have rights and powers. In law, we're known as natural persons. Other entities can also have legal personality, for example, incorporated companies. In a Western context, the American professor, Christopher Stone, had a vision for environmental legal personhood back in 1972, and he wrote a book entitled Should Trees Have Standing, and answered that question by telling us that trees, oceans, animals, and the environment as a whole should be bestowed with legal rights and a legal voice so they could be heard in the courts. But Te Urewera and the Whanganui River didn't become legal personalities to simply protect these places. So remember, the law was already providing layers of environmental protection against degradation. For example, Te Urewera had been a national park. This is the highest level of environmental protection possible in our system. A national park must be preserved in perpetuity in its natural state forever. So the legal personality of Te Urewera and the face of the Whanganui River are solutions born from the heartache and struggle to survive from an onslaught of European colonisation. In the lands of Te Urewera and the waters of the Whanganui River, the colonial atrocities of warfare, destruction and land confiscation have seeped deep, leaving our societies in disarray. And I believe there was a imprisonment, there was a prison talk, I think, as part of this week. And that's one of the sad instances of very high incarceration rates of Māori as a direct result of colonisation. The histories of the last 150 years or so are of our government killing non-combatant Māori men, women and children, using scorched earth policies to destroy Māori homes and food supplies, stealing Māori land, wrongfully imprisoning Māori, criminalising Māori customs and medical knowledges, and beating children for speaking the Māori language. So the wrongs of the past are the wrongs of the present too. So just in 2007, 300 armed police raided Māori in Te Urewera in response to alleged terrorism preparation camps. The horror of the day led to no discovery of a military camp and no persons found guilty of terrorism. All these past and contemporary actions were in terrible breach of our Treaty of Waitangi. It is remarkable that our country has now been able to reach settlements in such innovative, positive and inclusive ways that push the boundaries of our national imaginations. And it's important for me to emphasise that, because sometimes Aotearoa New Zealand is represented to the world as having the best race relations in the world. We don't. So the legislation described, this is Te Urewera Act, and it came into being in 2014, and I think is one of the most beautiful written statutes ever. And of course, I like reading legislation anyway, being a lawyer, but I think anyone would really enjoy reading this particular statute. The legislation describes this place as ancient and enduring, a fortress of nature, alive with history. So these are the words in the legislation. It says its scenery is abundant with mystery, adventure, and remote beauty. And importantly for us as Māori, and particularly for Tūhoi, the legislation recognises that this Te Urewera and this huge lake that sits in this landscape is the heart of the great fish of Maui. So remember I said how Maui, the demigod, stood on the boat and fished up that North Island. And so the North Island is the shape of the fish. Well, the heart of that fish is Te Urewera. Te Awa Tupua Whanganui River Act 2017 recognises that the Whanganui River is an ancestor of the Whanganui people. It is a spiritual and physical entity. It is indivisible and living whole, from the mountains to the sea, incorporating all the physical and metaphysical elements. And Taranaki, remember that male mountain that lost that love battle and was banished off to the side on the west coast? He too is going to become recognised as a legal person. So these places are being removed from the National Park Estate, which is unheard of, being removed from the National Park Estate because the Crown no longer owns these people. Māori are not recognised as owning these places because they own themselves. They are people. They have the same rights that we have as natural persons. And just looking at the time, internationally, others too are seeking legal personhood of their rivers, but I have to really emphasise here that I really see the value of legal personality working, not if the motivation is only environmental protection. I think legal personality offers us around the world much more than environmental protection. It has the power to displace and disrupt racism in our society and in our state laws. So in Aotearoa New Zealand, legal personhood only makes sense because it aligns with the indigenous Māori worldview. It makes sense because we are recognising our Māori indigenous ancestors. And in the opening words of now this plan for Te Urewera that Tūhoi have written, and you can read it in English, and I encourage everyone in the room to go online and read this most incredible writing and commitment that Tūhoi have made to this place. It reads very differently, for example, how a government would write a national park management plan. And so right at the beginning of this writing, so te kawa means the laws of Te Urewera. This is the commitment that is being made to Te Urewera. Tūhoi write, deliberatively, we are resetting our human relationships and behaviour towards nature. Our disconnection from Te Urewera has changed our humanness. We wish for its return. And I think that's the most incredible writing in the English language. So I've been teaching and researching law for 20 years. I and many others have consistently urged legislative reform of our government's assumptions of owning and managing lands and waters, including national parks and rivers. While I dreamed for radical legislative reform, we are now at the significant juncture in Aotearoa New Zealand. Te Urewera Act of 2014 and the Te Awa Tupua Act of 2017 make me immensely proud to be a New Zealander. A Māori way of understanding, caring for and nourishing land and water now has legal force. The national story of discovery and naming our lands has been seriously disrupted. There's more to these places than a European Western perspective. And the tool of legal personality as used in this country shows us this. Legal personality of the environment shows us another way of understanding nature and opens our eyes to a Māori world. So just in conclusion, the experience in Aotearoa New Zealand shows if we listen hard to Indigenous peoples, they too have ideas and solutions for all of us on how to care and to care for place. And so the idea of legal personality, I believe, is one of our greatest hopes around the world, to build a bridge to the Indigenous worldview of the personified landscape. And just to emphasize this is another one of my projects, research projects I'm involved in and very passionate about. And it's about really reinforcing us to fill our lives and our bookshelves with Indigenous writing, our Indigenous books. The Indigenous books provide so many ideas and solutions for us around the world and for us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This particular project here emphasises over 200 years of Māori writing in the English language now, and many of these books are now being written also in te reo in our Māori language. So Māori have been writing for more than 200 years, sharing ideas, and this is a celebration of just 150 of these non-fiction books across all disciplines that we emphasise. So thank you so much for this incredible opportunity to sit remotely with you all today, and hopefully one day I do have an opportunity to come to the University of Richmond. So thank you, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Professor Ruru, I see by among your many accomplishments are teaching awards. You're an inspiring speaker, and I'll turn things over to Chief Anne to pose a question, a comment, as you wish.
Jacinta, thank you so much. You're really changing paradigm in Indigenous communities and giving us an alternative to being able to buy land and possess it. So this is really groundbreaking work that you're doing, and something that I think is going to really change the way Indigenous communities relate to their land. So my question to you is, this was a legal procedure that you went through the court to get approved through the courts? How does that process take place?
So great question. And so our New Zealand government has set up a process. So the government itself in New Zealand has recognised that the government has done historical wrongs and has so been in a very purposeful, active process of creating modern settlements with Māori. And so this has been ongoing since the 1990s. And most of the country now, most Māori tribal entities have entered into a modern agreement with the New Zealand government, recognising past wrongs. So the government defines this as breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi between 1840 and 1992. So all of those are in a kind of a settlement process. Māori can choose to go into direct negotiations with the government, and then there's a whole government office that's set up, and it's, lawyers are making a huge amount of money from this, direct negotiations with the government. Or you can choose to go through our Waitangi Tribunal. The Waitangi Tribunal is a permanent commission of inquiry. It has both Māori leadership, strong Māori leadership expertise in there, plus also New Zealand European expertise on there as well. So you have lawyers, historians, anthropologists, governance, politics people, and as a permanent commission of inquiry, the Waitangi Tribunal will hear evidence of Treaty of Waitangi breaches over. And that tribunal process can be really healing, because it really is important to be able to speak to these atrocities and to have them recorded. And so that process can take a number of years, and then the tribunal will publish big reports and make recommendations to the government. And then there'll still be those direct negotiations. So there is a government process supporting this. Māori are also using the courts. And so sometimes Māori are certainly going through the courts seeking action as well, and particularly where the government is refusing or creating its bottom lines or refusing to budge on certain things. And the New Zealand government also recognises that its actions today can be in breach of the treaty. So we call those contemporary breaches. So breaches from 1992 onwards. And there's a whole lot of action going on around there as well. So on the imprisonment point, for example, Māori took an urgent claim through the Waitangi Tribunal, saying the Crown, our government, is breaching the Treaty of Waitangi today by locking up Māori into prisons. You know, the disproportionate number of Māori going into these prisons. You know, there's something more is going on to actually understand all that. So the tribunal's made a whole lot of recommendations to the government. The government can actually ignore those recommendations, and sometimes it does.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacinta, for a wonderful, wonderful talk. Your work connects with mine in some real fundamental ways. And I was really glad when I learned, when I was invited by Martha to join you. I did some Google surfing about you as well and learned about your work on the rights of nature. My mentor was Vine Delory Jr., the leading indigenous activist and philosopher. And we worked closely together. I was a student first, and then I had a chance to collaborate with him. And so he was the one who introduced me to Christopher Stone and the rights of nature approach and so on. And since that time, indigenous peoples in the United States have made real strides in trying to get both themselves and the larger society to understand the intimate relationship that we still have with the natural world. And so in two areas, international diplomacy, in the last 10 years, there have been 4 major international treaties here between indigenous peoples, both in the United States and Canada, sometimes with representation from Aotearoa and Australia as well. A treaty regarding the buffalo, our relationship to the buffalo, the wolf, and the grizzly bear as well, in just the last handful of years. And several of those treaties have over 200 signatories by other indigenous nations. So we're making steps in that way in terms of diplomacy. And in terms of the rights of nature, Evo Morales was the first person in this hemisphere, right? The president of Bolivia, to acknowledge the rights of nature in his constitution when he was elected president. Now we have a handful of native nations that have done the same thing. The White Earth Ojibwe in Minnesota, the state that I came from before I was at Richmond, passed a tribal ordinance granting rights of nature to wild rice, which is their most important food ingredient. And 3 tribes, the Yurok in California, the Menominee in Wisconsin, and the Nez Perce in the Plain States, have all acknowledged the rights of rivers that flow through their territory. So we're joining you, some of our nations, in doing that. And I just heard from Chief Anne that her nation is considering doing the same thing with with their sacred river as well. So I applaud you, and it's nice to know that we're forging these dynamic international linkages across the way. So with that said, I have a question for you. I teach occasionally a global indigenous peoples course, which is how I first learned about the Maori. And I noted you mentioned the treaty of the Waitangi Tribunal in the 1970s. What was it that enabled your people to get the New Zealand state to sit down and begin to engage diplomatically? Because you have made significant strides, more than most other indigenous peoples around the world. So how have you been able to do that? What do you view as the most essential qualities of your own people's leadership and way of governing and way of interacting with the natural world that has enabled you to make the strides that your people have in terms of your relationship with the state?
So excellent. So we're thinking about the 1970s in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And there's a number of things that are all come together to enable the country to recognise, okay, we're going to establish the Waitangi Tribunal. One of them is that idea that New Zealanders have been brought up with, this idea that we've got the best race relations in the world. So that is something that's, and we often compare ourselves to Australia, and we think about Australia having the terra nullius, and so we think that we have the best race relations in the world, and that started to really come under, that whole national myth came under attention in the 1970s in a very provocative way, I suppose. New Zealanders were becoming a lot more, what was happening over in the US about civil rights movements, particularly our love of the sport rugby, and what was happening in South Africa. And then there was the idea around apartheid, whether our rugby, we should be able to continue to play rugby with an apartheid nation, South Africa. And so our country was erupting into huge disputes around, that. And that was making New Zealanders reflect back on or those who were against the rugby tour, what are we actually, if we're against South Africa, but how have we actually treated Māori here in Aotearoa, New Zealand? So there's a lot of things that are going on that international stage that are making some New Zealanders think. We often talk, so I've said that Māori have always protested the Treaty of Waitangi from 1840 onwards, the Crown's interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi. There's been petitions to over to the King and the Queen over in England, so Māori travelling over there. There's been physical protests, there were the New Zealand Wars, so there's been all sorts of protests. In the 1970s, we had a very powerful elderly Māori woman, Dame Whina Cooper, and there's just been a documentary, it's just come out this year, so you could watch that. So Dame Whina Cooper led Māori from the top of the North Island by foot. They walked all the way down to Parliament as a very elderly lady walking the length of New Zealand with Māori. It was a very moving moment. And in the 1970s, New Zealanders really for the first time were able to really see that heartbreak of Māori protest because of television. We now had those visual images being beamed into New Zealand homes. And so the power of the television and the 6 o'clock news was a real moment for New Zealanders. Dame Whina Cooper and those Māori walking down had these big placards, "Not one more acre of Māori land." So they were protesting this idea that the government was still taking Māori land. So it was a very effective protest, and there was a number of other big protests going on. There was over 500-day occupation in Auckland, which is our main city, just on really central Auckland in many ways, Bastion Point. Over 500 days of Māori living peacefully there. And then day 501, all the New Zealand troops basically came in, helicopters and just hundreds, thousands, it felt like, police all lined up and forcibly removing Māori. And Māori are just sitting there, they're singing, elderly, and just seeing the horror of what happened that day at Bastion Point, again, is something that made national news. So there's a lot of things that are happening that raises the consciousness of New Zealanders. And we also have that political lever in New Zealand from the 1860s when our New Zealand government, so Māori are still the dominant population in the 1860s. We're 20 years after the signing of the treaty. In the 1860s, the government decides that all those who have, this is already the common law. So the common law introduced into New Zealand is that you can only vote if you own property. And because women couldn't own property, they couldn't vote. But if you owned property, you could vote. In the 1860s, the New Zealand government, I'm trying to say this very quickly, but the New Zealand government creates a native land court, a Māori land court that recognises all that Māori customary land can have a freehold title. So all of a sudden you had all this Māori, all Māori, dominant population having freehold title. They could vote. And then they would be able to determine the elections of New Zealand government. And there's no way the New Zealand government was going to allow this. So what they did is they said, Māori, okay, you can vote, but you can only vote for 4 electoral seats, the north, south, east and west. So restricted, heavily restricted the right of Māori to be able to vote. But what it meant is we had those 4 political seats in government. And while they were only 4, we have had Māori representation in Parliament since the 1860s. And so in the 1970s, over 100 years later, we had Māori politicians in government who were very charismatic and able to convince the country that setting up a tribunal was a good thing to do. And initially that Waitangi Tribunal, when it was established, was only able to look at Crown breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi in a contemporary sense. And it wasn't until 10 years later in the 1980s that the tribunal was empowered to look back from the 1840s onwards. So its early work in the late 1970s, early 80s was an idea of a modern breach of the treaty would be polluting a river or polluting an estuary or something like that. Māori would be taking claims to the tribunal and saying this act of polluting this waterway is a breach of the treaty.
Yeah. Well, one quick follow-up. It's interesting you mentioned that because in the United States, or what now the United States, the 574 native nations signed about 375 treaties, right? But we've never had any direct congressional representation until now. Right now, just in the New York Times today, there's an article about the Cherokee trying to have their 1835 delegate seated in Congress. And there's a good shot that might finally happen. Whereas in New Zealand, you've had those 4 seats since the 1860s. So it's interesting that. Thank you very much for your answers.
So as a political scientist, I really respect that sense that having presence over time accumulates influence. Yeah, excellent. I'm sure the audience has been anxiously waiting to come in on this. Have you got any questions either for the panelists or Dr. Ruru? Please, Sandra Yorman, another political scientist. We're thick on the ground here, Jacinta.
I'm curious about the use and enforcement of personhood rights when it comes to these entities. And I'm wondering if there has been occasion yet for these legal persons, the river and the forest, to assert their rights, for example, against injuries like pollution.
Yeah, so this is a great question. It often comes up, and I think we're still too early in the stage yet to see this kind of action come through. So certainly the Whanganui River is not a remote river. It's our 3rd longest river in the country. So it does, part of it travels through a national park, so it comes through some beautiful parts of the land, but there's also hydro dams, so there's hydroelectricity on there. It also travels past a lot of farming, so there's a lot of irrigation use, and then it comes through into the Whanganui city, so a major metropolitan urban city. So this river is a long river from a New Zealand perspective, not a US perspective, but it's our 3rd longest river and it goes through many places. And so it's certainly the local planning laws for this river is now changing in terms of having to recognise the well-being of that river, and particularly 2 people have been appointed to speak on behalf of the river. And so from a Māori perspective, your health and well-being are totally reliant on the health and well-being of the lands and waters around you. So if your lands and waters are unwell, if they are polluted and dying, then you as a people are polluted and dying. So it relates that whole relationship is very connected. But to answer your question, there around what action has potentially come yet and what has happened, I think we're still too early to see anything, but there potentially could very well be. And often people say, well, actually the river, you could sue the river, particularly if it floods. What if it floods and damages our property? You could sue the river. So yeah, of course you could sue the river. It's a natural person, but what's your remedies going to be? It doesn't exactly have money. So all of that I think is a really, it's going to be an interesting part of our future. I'm really looking forward to that.
Yes, in the back.
Yeah, thank you, Violet. Great talk. Going off that question a little bit, I was kind of wondering, since these geographical features have been granted legal personhood, say if, such that no one governing body can really, claim ownership of it. Is there, say that a crime is committed or something of that nature, on the mountain. Is there one governing body that kind of takes control of, what laws apply and where, or is that more given to like that tribunal or someone that speaks for that feature?
Yeah, so I'll answer that. I'll take the Te Rewera one as our example here. So the Te Rewera, those lands and waters, it is revolutionary what has been enabled there in terms of that recognition of the legal personality, but there still needs to be a system of care that's put in place. And so that system of care, the legislation says that it's a majority of Tūhoe people. I think it's a 75% majority of Tūhoe people are responsible for caring for that place. But the government still has a role there. So the government can still appoint some people to that governing, to care for that place. So that's just at that people level. And then from the New Zealand legal system way, some of those New Zealand laws still apply there to some of the broader New Zealand laws around, what would be a good example? I don't know, mining, being able to cut down the trees, general New Zealand law is still applicable in Te Rewera, but the legislation also states that Tūhoe law is also applicable. So New Zealand's going through quite a revolutionary moment and fully recognising that the first legal system of New Zealand is our Māori legal system. And while our legislation and our courts have always kind of, I suppose, recognised but been at odds with Māori law and trying to replace that Māori legal system with the European inherited legal system, that's now changed. And we've just recently, actually in the last few weeks, had a big Supreme Court decision here that is firmly recognising that our Māori laws are relevant not just for Māori but for New Zealand. And so we had a New Zealand, we'd say Pākehā, a New Zealand European man, there's nothing to do with Māori, no Māori association with it at all. And the whole case there was drawing on Māori legal system as a valid legal system for our New Zealand courts to be thinking about and engaging and applying and so on. So if there's a wrong done in, for example, Te Rewera and the lake on the forests there, it'll be a mix of both New Zealand state national law, but also that Māori law, and really on the ground, it's going to be that Māori law that will be most applicable in the first instance. And that Māori, so just I haven't really spoken at all about Māori, the Māori legal system. So all legal systems around the world share a lot of similarities. All legal systems regard some actions as abhorrent, like murder and so on. But there's different philosophical bases to those legal systems. And so I'd often talk about maybe the New Zealand legal system at its heart as notions of justice, maybe fairness, sort of democracy, all that's kind of really important to the New Zealand legal system. The Māori legal system, at the heart of the Māori legal system is this notion, whanaungatanga, which means relationships. So the glue that holds the Māori legal system and the Māori world together is genealogical relationships. That is the most important driving value factor in the Māori world, is who you're related to, what if there's been a murder, let's say, there's been something, a real wrong that's been done. It's that the first thing you're going to come to is thinking about relationships and not just between people, but between the environment. So that's just a very brief kind of insight. And so if there's a wrong that's done within Te Rewera, I think the whanaungatanga action and that whakapapa, the genealogical connections, is going to be an overriding factor. Sorry, it's a very brief insight into that.
And provocative and interesting. Thank you. Question up front.
Well, now I have two questions. But one of them short, one of them long. The first question, first of all, thank you so much for speaking. It's been wonderful listening to you. I will admit I know very little about these kinds of laws, and I know even little about New Zealand. So yes, it's very wonderful learning about it. My first question is kind of basic, but so all of these lands are being recognized with like the rights of like personhood. Is that under the New Zealand like legal system, or the I'm gonna pronounce it wrong, I'm sorry. Māori legal system, or both?
Both. I'll say both. And yeah, both.
And then follow-up question. So from a legal perspective, like having that that legal personhood status, does that make it easy? Like, does that make it easier to bring like offenses against the land to court, or does it make like penalties hard? Like, how does that compare to them just being national parks?
So the being a national park has been a disaster from a Māori perspective. As all the national park is the whole presumption of a colonial way that so no, I shouldn't really say it's been a disaster. Look, I should start that again. So the notion that we still have a third of our country and are protected from private, that they haven't been clear-felled, these lands, these forests, that we still have these places. A third of the country has been protected as national parks in a conservation way. That's something that we are very proud of and very thankful for. So that there's common alignment between Māori and the government for the need for protecting these places, that we need to retain these places for all of us as New Zealanders. So common alignment there. There is a fundamental difference in how we care for those places. And so from the national park model is around preservation, around locking it up, only seeing a human connection to these places from a utilitarian use, maybe from scenery. A scenic value is going to bring tourism into New Zealand, and people will be able to walk through these parks. And of course now a scientific value as well to these places. But that's basically it. Otherwise, these are locked up places. So Māori have been entirely excluded from their idea, from continuing to implement their system of care for these places. And now I've forgotten your question, sorry. Can you just repeat it? Sorry.
Well, I kind of forgot my question.
Is it under both jurisdictions, both the national governmental one and Māori law?
Well, my question was mostly about like, does it, so for example, if something were, I don't know, if like the river was polluted, obviously, and I'm saying this from a very, like, I literally only know the US legal system, but the river's polluted, is it treated as if like a person was polluted or like a person was hurt in that sense? or is it treated in the sense of like a national park? Like how that person who's doing the polluted, like what changes about like how they're being sentenced, or like what changes about like the trial, I guess?
So, I suppose we haven't had any illegal polluting of a river yet, and that illegal damage to water would be a very interesting case to come through. So we're still the law. So there's a whole, New Zealand does have some quite strong environmental, we call resource management laws. And if anyone wants to do anything with a river or land, you know, it has to be permitted if you want to cut down a tree or take anything, you know. So there's quite a lot of environmental protection that is running over it. I'll just, I see we're just about to hit 11 o'clock, but if you Google Te Udawera, you may see that one of the big controversial stories in New Zealand over the last few weeks has been, Tūhoe has been removing these huts. So I don't know, so one of my greatest joys is hiking, tramping, so I do spend a lot of time in these national parks, and I've visited national parks in the US, but I haven't overnighted in national parks in the US, so I'm not quite sure of the system there, but in New Zealand, we've got a whole system of trails and huts, so very basic huts, which basically 4 walls and a roof and a couple of bunk beds and maybe a sink if you're lucky with some running water coming in, and a long drop toilet, you know, a few hundred meters away from the actual hut itself. So there's a whole lot of these huts in Te Udawera, but from the Tūhoe perspective, they're like, well, why would we keep those huts? They're all rat infested and old, and they're a colonial construct. And so they've been removing them. New Zealanders have been a huge outcry. How dare Tūhoe remove these dock huts? But it's from a Tūhoe perspective, they're saying, well, we want to invite visitors from around the world in New Zealand to experience Tūhoe as we experience it. We want to have an authentic experience of these, being in these lands, sleeping on these lands, rather than being in these rat-infested huts. So anyway, that's just a kind of a big controversy that I think New Zealanders are now starting to understand, but it was headline news there a couple of weeks ago, and kind of outrage when you just see it from that first point of Tūhoe's removing all these dock huts. But if you start to more deeply understand why they are doing this, I think New Zealanders are starting to appreciate that, and they're going to get a much better experience. The experience now of going through Te Udawera that's still open to the world is, rather than just having a very sterilized experience of walking through some forest, around a lake, sleeping a night and then leaving, is that you're going to have Tūhoe guides. They're going to tell you about this place being the heart of the great fish of Maui. You're going to really learn about this whole place from a Māori perspective, and hopefully alongside some of our trained Western scientists as well, who can really talk about the biodiversity of this place and that biodiversity from a Māori perspective. And you're just going to have such a different experience, and I think a much more enriching experience because of this new law.
What a great example. I'm so sorry we're out of time to show you that, though it seems like Jacinta is in our living room with us right now. It's 11 o'clock in the morning there on a work day, whereas we're all winding down. But I did want to send a special kia ora with your permission, Phil. Here's your colleague from Otago.
Oh, there's Phil. Kia ora, Phil.
And a bit behind him is our guest from NYU, Lauren Rick Eisen, who gave a talk today about incarceration. I'm sorry you weren't here.
Fantastic.
So back to our panelists who probably want to sign off with you. It's been such a pleasure. I recently was reading Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a botanist who heads a Center of Indigenous Science here in New York. And she was talking about the pronouns in her late in life acquired Indigenous language. And hearing your remarks, Jacinta, I was powerfully reminded, you know, there's the animate pronoun and the inanimate pronoun. And all of us are on the animate side: trees, human beings, animals, also rocks and water. And inanimate pronouns are generally things that have been made by humans. So like a table, maybe made of wood, but it's not animate. And your remarks have really situated us in a whole different perspective and world in an astonishingly concise hour. So thank you to the audience who's been traveling together with us in Aotearoa, New Zealand for a week, tomorrow being our last day, and to these panelists who've joined us for their first dialogue with you. We're so grateful, and we do hope to have you here in Richmond to share our James River and other stories of our habitat here in Richmond. Will you join me in thanking our
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Amazing to sit with you all.
Very good. Thanks, Jacinta. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you now.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.